Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Vick. I work for Whale and Dolphin Conservation. We are a global organisation dedicated to the protection and conservation of whales and dolphins. I'm also an author of books for young people. So, in my working life and as an author, I know how important stories are in helping people understand the conservation needs for whales and dolphins, and how important books and stories are at conveying the wonders of them. So that's my book, The Last Whale. But the reason for us meeting here today, without further ado, is for me to interview the very wonderful Hannah Gold, who has written this book, The Lost Whale, who also wrote The Last Bear, which was Waterstone's Children's Book of the Year, and also the Blue Peter Book of the Year. So it's a very famous, well-reviewed, and much loved book. But we're not here to talk about bears. We're here to talk about whales. And this book I absolutely love. So we've got a bit of news about Hannah, which we're going to get in at the end. Oh, and happy World Book Day, by the way, I should say.
Yes, happy World Book Day.
We're going to ask each other some questions, talk a bit about stories, talk a bit about conservation, and then I've got a bit of news about Hannah and WDC at the end that we'd love to share. Okay, so we'll dive straight in. Hannah, as you know, because I've told you before, I absolutely love this book. One of the things I love about it is that there's almost the two sort of interrelated but almost quite separate stories going on at the same time. One is very much about Whitebeak and about Rio in America, but it's also stuff about his mum and what's going on with her. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about what those two sort of, well, a bit about the book really, about what those two sub-stories or subplots are. But also what I'm really interested to hear about is why you had that story going on with the mum as well as the story with the whale.
Well, I have no idea, Chris, because it made it really, really difficult to write for myself. But the whole, I really wanted that the heart of the book, I wanted it to be about Rio, who's the central protagonist, who's 11 years old, who forms this relationship with this grey whale in the Pacific Ocean called Whitebeak, who you've referenced. But in order for that story dynamic to work, as you know, as an author, you need to put some parameters around your central characters. So it was, okay, I'm going to put him in these new surroundings of California, and I'm going to put him with somebody he doesn't know, which is this grandmother that he has, who he has very limited relationship with. But to be there alone, there has to be a reason why his primary caregiver, in this case his mother, isn't there with him. So I always like that space, which I had in The Last Bear as well, with the space for the child to have this adventure without really the gaze of the parent upon them. And so with all those kind of dynamics in place, there was a reason why mum had to stay at home. And I toyed with various kind of different factors, but in the end we decided upon giving her some sort of mental health issues, which is something that my family have experienced. So it felt like I could write about it with a degree of authenticity, and I thought in that way, by running those two storylines parallel, Rio's main drive in the book is to try to save his mother, as it were, though he understands ultimately that you can't save another human from what's going on in their head. But that's his drive throughout the book. So when he comes face to face with this amazing grey whale and realizes potentially she's in trouble, he thinks, well, this is something which is potentially within his control. So if he can try to save Whitebeak, he then thinks maybe he's trying to save his mother at the same time. So that was that sort of dual storyline dynamic and background, and how I tried to get it across. But it was really difficult to write.
Yeah, brilliant. So there's some lessons in there about, I suppose this ties into the whole conservation theme really, about what you can save and what you can't, and how powerful are we as individuals, what we can do. I wanted to ask what part you think stories can play. I mean, I'm bound to say it's really important because I believe stories are important. But what part do you think that stories can play in conservation? I suppose what I'm asking is, what do you think stories can do that just factual narratives can't do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I just think stories bring the natural world and these amazing animals to life. And I'm not saying a non-fiction book can't do that, because absolutely they can. But there's something about being engrossed in a narrative, maybe a page-turning story, an adventure that takes the reader onto the high seas, that takes them onto a boat whale watching, or even in the case of your book, puts them in the midst of a storm and they're in, they're in the ocean sort of battling for their survival. I just think that's just makes it really electric and really alive. And I think the more visceral the experience for the reader, be they 8 or 16 or even 60, the more engaged emotively I think the reader can become. And that's something I really try to put into my stories, just a really big sense of emotion, because the more that we engage our heart sense, I think the more that we as readers care about what's happening in the books, which ultimately transfers to hopefully caring outside of the book and maybe after the book, perhaps making some little changes, or even just being, I suppose, psychologically or mentally changed by it in some way.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, obviously, we're both writing books about whales
With uncannily similar titles.
with uncannily similar
to get them
titles.
right, yeah.
But they're both, I mean, in both instances, it's kind of the perfect title. Do you think that nature writing and animal stories, they've always been there, but are those sort of stories having a bit of a moment? And and if so, why?
They probably are having a moment. I mean, I think whale stories have always been really popular with kids, because even if you go to down to picture book level, there's so many picture books which are about whales or dolphins or the ocean. It's a really sort of tangible place to start. But I do think, talking about the serious issue of climate change and things like that, an endangered species, of which whales, many species of whales are amongst those, there's such a prevalence to write about it at the moment, because I suppose it's giving the authors an agency about trying to make a difference. And I do think many of the authors that you've mentioned are authors that, like yourself, who's involved in conservation directly, are people that genuinely care. They're not just writing it. You didn't write the last word because, oh, I'm going to write a book about whale because it might be in. You wrote this book because it's something that you're genuinely passionate about, and same here. So I think it stems from a place of passion and caring and observation of what's going on around the world, but trying to, I hope, put it in a positive light. Many of the books do. I know that I try to, putting it into a positive spin, so somebody reading it isn't going to be depressed by reading it, but actually it's left the feeling of, or maybe I can go out now and make a difference. Maybe I can do something to care for these amazing creatures.
So books like ours, dare I say, can be perhaps a sort of safe place for young people to explore really quite serious issues and potentially depressing issues, because the natural world is up against it. That's putting it mildly, especially with global warming. But then there is that hope, isn't there?
Yeah,
We can offer people hope.
and I really like the ending of your book as well, because I took my time reading yours, because it was such a detailed and sort of quite a very interesting story, and again it offers that hope at the end, which I tried to do with The Lost Whale and even The Last Bear. It's about leaving the reader saying, this is the situation. I mean, mine doesn't talk about climate change so much as talk about like ocean pollution and things like that.
Yeah.
But this is the situation. But actually, maybe it sounds really twee when I say it, but I think for children specifically, sound bites do kind of work, because global warming is such an overarching issue that many kids do not understand it. They can't break it down into into tangible things. Whereas if you kind of give them tangible actions, or even like an overarching feeling, then I think hope always leads to something positive, whereas apathy just leads to nothing.
Yeah. Okay. So apathy is a one-way street.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
One-way street to
pessimism will only sort of go to one conclusion, whereas hope won't necessarily. So you kind of answered my next question, I think, which is kind of, do you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist? I guess you're an optimist.
Oh, I'm totally. Look, I've got my glass 3/4 full to prove it. Yeah, no, I always am, Chris, because I think I've always been an optimist. And even when we look at things like endangered species and melting ice caps, the ocean, there's still so many people out there that represent hope and the best of humanity, and be it authors, or be it like conservation sort of charities, or be it children who go to school and campaign for their teachers for sort of to ban single-use plastic, or be it the one person in the family unit that's nagging the others to turn off the lights or to recycle more. I think you find hope everywhere, and if you open your lens to look at it, that's where we need to direct our focus, and then turning that hope into sort of positive action. It is a tall order, I admit, but you've got to look positively, otherwise yeah, why would you go down that rabbit hole of just being really doomsday sort of feeling?
Yeah, why do you think, I mean, aside from the kind of the answers you've already given, which is about the importance of the natural world and conservation, all those kind of things, was there anything particular, or was there a particular reason why you found yourself writing about the natural world and animals rather than perhaps social issues or politics or kind of fantasy novels or anything like that? So you've clearly, I think, chosen a path of naturalism, writing about real things rather than fantastical things, pretty much, and particularly about the natural world, and then, dare I say, particularly about bears and grey whales. So why that rather than other things?
I think, as authors, and you will know this, you do, I think, write about, and it is a cliche, you do write about what you love. And for me, I've always just found animals just really special, and the bond that we have with them. I've always been a pet owner. I look after them dearly. They're like members of my family. So when it became, I often tell the children this, when it became time for me to write my own children's book, I obviously wasn't going to write about my cat, because I find her interesting, but nobody else might find her as fascinating. And that's when I decided to write about the polar bear, and the polar bear sort of came to me. And it was only then, when researching about habitat, that I realized the extent of how much they are being affected by loss of habitat and climate change. And similar with whales, but whales was a bit different, because when I originally got my 2-book deal, the first book was The Last Bear, and they said, what else have you got? And I said, well, I've got this book about whale. And I really didn't know much about it at the time. I just knew I wanted to write about a whale, because many years ago I had seen some whales off the coast of California and been fascinated by them. And I just knew that was the animal I wanted to go to next. And similarly, when I started researching about whales, and we went whale watching, and hopefully we can compare notes in a minute, when I went whale watching and I came face to face with the whales, and you know this more than me, Chris, I was just absolutely just blown away and transported and transformed by my contact with them. And I just think, yeah, if we can try to capture some of that beauty in the pages of a book of a wild animal and transport the child or the teenager there, that's something really magical.
Yeah, I'm bound to agree. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have seen whales and dolphins, many different kinds in different parts of the world. And I'm certainly not in any sense immune to it, but there's almost nothing that compares with that first contact, shall we say. And my first reaction of seeing whales in the wild is the same one that I see time and time again, where people just go, wow. They just say wow is always the word, and you're left slightly, depending on what you see, gobsmacked, and depending on what you see. But as you know, because you've seen them, they are kind of, whales particularly, even bigger than you imagine.
Yeah, Yeah, something I do on my school visits is like, because I write about the grey whale, which is the seventh biggest whale, and we get a tape measure and measure the whale out with all the children sort of filling up the space of how long the whale is. And it's literally like so many kids. And that really brings it home. So if you say, oh, the grey whale is maybe 12 meters long, it doesn't really mean anything. But when you measure all these children out across an auditorium or the assembly hall, it's like, wow. But you're right, that feeling and that when you see the whale for the first time, it is just like amazing. And above your shoulder, you've got the eye. And one of the questions I was going to ask you is kind of like when you look into the whale's eye, and you talk about that in your book, what's the feeling that you get?
Good question. So my first ever whale watching experience was orca. It was killer whales, which are actually the largest member of the dolphin family. And we were sort of hanging around in boats for days without much success. We didn't really see any other than.
Was this, where was this, Scotland or?
No, this was Vancouver. North Vancouver Island. And then we got lucky and we had a very calm day. We saw some orcas, and of course you shouldn't ever kind of harass whales. You really need to be kind of in the same vicinity, and if you're lucky, that they'll come to you. And quite often, I've seen this a lot, especially with dolphins, is they're actually quite curious. And there was a mum and a calf, and the calf broke away from the mum, and of course you can see the black and white shape under the water, and just swam under, went under the boat, tiny little boat, came up the other side, and turned over and looked at me.
Wow.
So actually, for one thing you see when you see that whale really up close is how it's the eye, an animal eye that is most like a human eye.
Yeah, it is. It's got little lashes almost, I seem to recall, or something like that.
Maybe I'm making that up. But you also have this thing of not just that. The thing, to answer your question, that has the most impact is that you are not just looking at it. You have a really strong sense of it looking at you and regarding you and taking you in and kind of weighing you up in a way that is very different to looking into the eyes of a dog or a cat or a horse or anything. That really did sort of set the hairs on the back of the neck.
You really realize they're a sentient being with intelligence, don't you? Because I had that experience as well as the whale, the grey whale, being under the boat and looking up at me. And someone actually said, "Look, the whale was looking at you, Hannah," and it really did feel like they were looking at me, and exactly like you say, Chris, just taking you in, observing you, maybe forming some, maybe I'm projecting here, but forming some almost assessment. But there was real emotion and energy and intelligence in that eye. So, Chris, tell me about your conservation work then, because what I'm really fascinated about is how the conservation work that you do actually fits in to your writing and how the two sort of blend together.
Okay. So I've written quite a few books about the sea, all of which at some point seem to feature a whale or dolphin. But that's very much about the kind of thing that you were talking about, Hannah, which is the wonder of seeing the whale in the wild. It's not so much about the kind of research, the theory, anything like that. What's different about this, comes out back on screen, the last whale, is one of the things we've been working on at WDC, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, in the last sort of 4 or 5 years is something that we call the green whale. So what we're finding is that whales are really important for fertilizing plankton, which soaks up huge amounts of carbon. So we're just really beginning to discover how important they are for the whole of the ecosystem. And we're literally trying to count whales, including from satellites and all these kind of things. And the suspicion or the fear is that the whale numbers are going down. And if the whale numbers really go down, they're obviously going to make much less contribution to the fertilization of phytoplankton, and the ocean's, its literal capacity to soak up carbon is reduced. Now, that was a rather scary concept, but it was also a very, very compelling one, because a good way to start a story is that what if idea. What if this happened? What if the apocalypse happened? What if we're suddenly overrun by zombies? What if all the whales disappear? So as soon as I got, it was I haven't had much cross-referencing from the whale work to the writing work, but that idea was so strong, so compelling, and frankly so important. If we lose the whales, we're in real difficulty. So it was, and then I sort of thought, okay, well, that's quite a good narrative, but I'm also really interested in young people's activism and in how far they're willing to go. So, and where you balance radicalism with perhaps a more conservative way of doing things. So I kind of had these two things. I had the family story and the family dynamics of this Norwegian family, and particularly of Abby, this activist, and the whales. And it's it's when two separate ideas suddenly collide, and you've got to write that story.
Yeah,
that's what happened.
Yeah, and would you say that you're an optimist as well? Because reading your book at the end, your book is kind of, I suppose, starker than mine in terms of like pointing out what will happen if we do get down to the last whale. Do you feel like there's hope?
Yes, 100%. I'm very much glass half. I mean, it drives everyone I know nuts that I'm sort of continually optimistic and glass half full. There is plenty of reason to be really depressed about the natural world and about climate change, but I also have faith in people. I especially have faith in the younger generation going into schools, as I know you do, and talking to them. It's their world. They are really attuned to a lot of all kinds of issues, not just environmental, but really attuned and prepared to act on it, prepared to do something about it. And actually, with AI and with technology, we are getting huge advances really quickly. And I think if we're smart, we can use tech. Tech can be used really wisely to come up with some really good solutions. So it varies day to day, but I think mostly I'm an optimist.
What we talk about in The Lost Whale is being a citizen scientist, which is this whole idea of actually monitoring wildlife or species by using a counting system and then seeing how much is there and how much have we lost. And we use it in The Lost Whale to count the whales, and the system that I referenced called Happy Whale Database is actually a real life database where you can spot a whale and kind of log its movements and log your sighting. But going back to what you're saying about AI, we can actually do that with technology. But at the moment, if somebody wants to get on board and sort of count whether it's a fungi species or butterflies or birds, we've still got that power to do that within our own hands. And I find that really empowering as well, the fact that wherever you live in the world, you can actually become this citizen scientist.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because one of my questions was going to be, one of the questions I get asked a lot actually is, well, what can I do? What can I as an individual do? It's so overwhelming. You're talking about all of nature and whales, which are, are out at sea, and I live in Coventry in the middle of, the middle of the country or something like that. It's kind of what can I do? How does it affect me? How do I affect it? And actually the reality is there's a whole bunch of things you can do. So you mentioned the citizen science, and there are, I mean, if you are lucky enough to live near a piece of moorland or forest or on the coast, there are lots of citizen science activities that you can get involved in. There is plenty you can actually do from the computer, as you've highlighted. But there's also a bunch of other stuff. I'm bound to say this: you can adopt a whale with whale and dolphin conservation.
I'll do because
get your mum and dad, auntie, grandma.
I said it's one of the best presents you can give somebody, like to adopt a dolphin or a whale, and I think they make such gorgeous kind of gift packs as well. So absolutely.
So you can adopt a whale. That's important.
Via the
WDC, adopt a whale. There are lots of petitions and things that you can sign. I mean, some have more power than others, but politicians do listen. It doesn't let them off the hook. If they are getting these petitions asking them to take note of the natural world and to do things, that they do listen to that. We've discussed it with them and their offices. So you can do that. You can be what they call an armchair activist. On a very practical level, global warming is so important, and it affects whales in a massive way. Although again, they are, as I said earlier, they are part of the solution. Have less carbon impact yourself. Fly less, drive less. We all go on holidays, we all get in cars. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we can or should all stop that, but we can all do that bit less. We can all have a bit less of a carbon impact. Eating local sustainable fish like mackerel. So, Hannah, would you please read a little bit of The Lost Whale for us?
My pleasure, Chris. So we've established that the story is a boy called Rio who goes to the west coast of America to stay with his grandmother whilst his mum is at home, and his mum is being treated for some undiagnosed sort of mental health condition. And so when he's in America, he meets a new friend called Marina, whose dad runs handily these whale watching tours. And then Rio goes out on this boat whale watching for the first time. And when he's on the boat, he comes face to face with this amazing animal. Here, this is the grey whale, the Pacific grey whale. And this one is called Whitebeak. And he's so excited, but he falls in the water. So this is what happens next. And Rio knew in his heart that it was Whitebeak. As if in agreement, he felt a gentle nudge on his back. His first reaction was to spin round, but turning round in water wasn't easy. All Rio ended up doing was flopping face down. He gasped for air, swallowed some more seawater before finally managing to maneuver himself the right way up. She was so close. He could see the individual barnacles lining the right side of her face, how the white pigmentation covered nearly all of her upper jaw, but was patchier around the very tip of her snout. And he could smell her skin, brine and oil and fish. Rio should have been scared, but somehow he wasn't. "Hello, Whitebeak," he whispered. It is you, isn't it?" Rio wanted to reach out and touch her, but he didn't dare. There was something precious about the whale that commanded respect, like Mum's most expensive violin, the one she used only for important concerts, which she kept wrapped up in its case at all times. You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice cracking. And from nowhere, a burst of emotion filled his chest, so hard and so bright he had to close his eyes momentarily. When he opened them again, Whitebeak was right in front of him, gazing at Rio in a way that made his heart tremble. It didn't make any sense, not logically anyway, but it was the same way Mum used to gaze at him, full of love. And the thought that such a love could come from a wild animal should have felt strange, especially from an animal which had been so mistreated by humans. But somehow it didn't. It felt as though this love had always been there, and always would be. Theirs was a bond as old as time and as deep as the ocean.
Yay, beautifully read. And, you know, we were talking about that sort of connection that you feel when you see an animal like that in nature, kind of in the raw. You know, that comes across wonderfully.
One of my intentions with the book is always to get kids to feel. I always ask the children, "What pets do you have?" And we talk about how much they love their pets. And obviously, a whale or a bear is not a pet. But what I try to suggest is that if we care for these wild animals as much as we care for our pets, then we can create a safer and a kinder and a more compassionate world. So that's always my primary objective that I try to drive through. If I do have an agenda, which is more of an instinctive agenda, you know, and I think that's the wrong word, but that's the primary motivation behind the books.
So that very personal experience has a bigger implication in terms of how we treat the whole world, really, and how we live in it as a community of both people and animals. Fantastic. Before we go, we at WDC occasionally we sort of bump into people who are doing wonderful things for whales and dolphins, and we invite those people to become ambassadors for us, to really help us in our quest, basically, in our mission to save whales and dolphins. And we would be delighted if you would join WDC as an ambassador.
You know what, that touches me so much, because it's like, it would be such an honor. And one of my dreams, I have all these author dreams, and one of them has always been to be like an ambassador for conservation, and it would be my absolute pleasure and joy, and I offer my heart full of gratitude for the opportunity. to use this platform for the greater good.
That's a big yes, viewers. Okay, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
No, thank you everyone.